Most politicians, as everybody has probably observed, tend to be lawyers. As we've already discussed, most lawyers are Masons. Therefore, a lot of politicians are Masons. Many heads of state are Masons. At least 17 presidents of the United States have been Freemasons. Let's talk about the Revolutionary War period. I've already mentioned that Benjamin Franklin was a Mason. Pardon me, yeah, Franklin, Benedict Arnold, Paul Revere, George Washington, possibly Jefferson, we don't know that for sure. John Adams was a strong anti-Mason, though. Now let me talk for a moment about Washington, though. The Masons make an incredible amount of hay out of the fact that Washington was a Mason. I mean, I'm sure some of you have even seen, like around the time of Washington's birthday, they have ads in the paper, you know, showing Washington presiding over the Grand Lodge and so on and so on. Let me tell you something. All of that is basically fiction. I document in my book, Masonry Beyond the Light, the fact that, yeah, Washington was a Mason. He joined when he was an officer in the British Army in his youth, dare I say, before he knew better. Additionally, in those days, if you wanted to get anywhere in the officers' corps of the British Army, you had to be a Mason. But I have a letter documented in my book that proves that at the end of his life, Washington wrote a clergyman, and he said that he had not been inside of a Masonic lodge for 30 years. So much for him being a devout Mason. I think he basically figured out early on that there was nothing that he needed to belong to and basically just walked away from it. There was no teaching in those days that you had to renounce Masonry or do anything like that, and so he just basically stopped going. And he made that very clear. Plus, on his deathbed, he denounced Masonry because he had discovered it to become a tool for bringing the Illuminati into America. How about 20th century politics? Look at all these darlings of the conservative right. Jesse Helms, Bob Dole, Strom Thurmond, Ronald Reagan, who was made an honorary Mason, Gerald Ford, Harry Truman, and Franklin D. Roosevelt. All of these people were high-level Masons with the exception of Reagan, who was just made an honorary Mason. Now think of that. All these people except Reagan have taken Holy Communion out of a human skull, because that's what's involved in being a 33rd degree Mason. And you would not believe the oath that these people have to take. They swear that they will work for the destruction of law, religion, and government. And then you wonder why this is so bizarre today in our government, our political system. Freemasonry has been called America's civil religion, and rightly so. You will often find Masonic worshipful masters laying the cornerstones for civic buildings. I'm sure some of your civic buildings, like post offices or courthouses, have had blessings by Masonic worshipful masters. And of course, a blessing from a worshipful master is like a curse. Then we have the nation's capital. This is a map of the nation's capital. And you will notice, I'm going to spin this a little here. This here is the Capitol itself. You'll notice the little horned goat guy there around the Capitol. Then here is the square. Here is the compass. One point of it is over the Jefferson Memorial, and conveniently the other point of it is over the White House. Now this shows it a little bit more clearly. Actually, that may be reversed, but I'm not going to mess with it. You'll see here we have an inverted pentagram pointing straight at the White House. You ever wonder why our president is having all of these problems? Then down the road a piece, just 13 blocks away from the White House, is the House of the Temple, which is the supreme headquarters of the Scottish Rite. Ever wonder, number 13? Well, we're going to talk a little more about that later. So you see here that and the Masons brag about this. There are articles in Masonic magazines about how a Mason laid out Washington, D.C. A Mason laid down the architecture and everything for Washington, D.C. Okay, now we're going to talk about Masonry and the New World Order. For as long as the conspiracy has existed, which is basically since the Tower of Babel, that was the world's first United Nations. How many of you realize that? The Masons have been working to basically accomplish two things: the destruction of the worship of the true and living God on the one hand, and secondly, the establishment of a one-world government and a one-world religion. And if you notice, you see that even right in the Tower of Babel. If you read that chapter, Genesis 11, it talks about, they say, let us build a tower and a city. The tower is a symbol of religious Babylon. The city is a symbol of political Babylon. And you put them together, and there's the New World Order. Now, since that time, down through the centuries, Masonry has worked either behind the scenes or even out in the open to try to destroy things for the church. Now, it started getting pretty obvious during the time of what is called historically the Enlightenment. Now, that was a period just after the Protestant Reformation in the early 17th century, or pardon me, 1700s, where this new philosophy came about called the Enlightenment. And it was the idea that we didn't need faith anymore. We didn't need religion anymore. We had a new God rising, and that God's name, science. That science could give us the answers, that logic and reason could give us all the answers we needed, and we no longer needed to have all of these other things going on. We no longer needed to have faith in this invisible God that could not be put in a test tube, so to speak, and measured. And so the Enlightenment came along, and that was followed very quickly on by the Illuminati coming on the scene. Two of the earlier members of the Enlightenment who were also Freemasons were Francis Bacon and Elias Ashmole. And what happened is Francis Bacon wrote a book called The New Atlantis. And that book was basically trying to evoke the spirit of the original continent of Atlantis. Now, some of you may know, some of you may not. Atlantis is a mythical continent that supposedly existed in the days several hundred years before Christ, and supposedly was like the golden age. I mean, it had great science, it had great philosophy, great occult powers, great technical achievements. And it was sunk under the sea because of its pride. Some people believe that that is a reflection of the Noahic flood in Greek myth. There may be other explanations. But what Francis Bacon wanted to do was create a new Atlantis on the American continent where Masonry and occultism could be practiced openly. The most obvious, and what I tell people, quite frankly, is that Masonry and Christianity have been struggling in this country for 200 plus years. It's kind of like Esau and Jacob in the womb fighting. And that conflict has never fully been resolved, even to this very day. And one of the earliest manifestations of this conflict was in what I call Satan's seal of approval, the Great Seal of the United States. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on this, but let me just say this much. Down through the centuries, right from the year 1776, the United States began working on a seal. And this seal was usually worked on by committees that were composed predominantly of Masons. Now, down through the years, by the time we get up to this century, the seal was more or less obscure. But then Henry Wallace, Henry Morgenthau, and FDR, all Masons, decided they wanted to place this seal on the back of the dollar bill. And of course, that's where it remains to this day. So in 1935, we had the Great Seal placed on the back of our dollar bill. Scottish Rite magazine brags about the number of Masonic attributions that are on the Great Seal's obverse. Now, by obverse, I mean the front of the seal. And you'll see there, for example, all of the numbers 13. That's a Masonic number, by the way. The number is 32, and we're going to actually get into this now. I'm going to put up a thing of the seal on the board. Several interesting coincidences, if you believe in such things. For example, there are 32 feathers in this wing for the 32 degrees of the Scottish Rite. There are 33 feathers in this wing for the 33rd degree. Down below, there are 9 feathers in the tail of the bird, contrary to what the Scottish Rite magazine, obviously in addition to being spiritually deceived, Masons can't count, there are 9 feathers in this tail, which represents the 9 degrees of the York Rite. What could be simpler? So, then look at that eagle. What's the deal with the eagle? Well, we know it's a noble bird, but how many of you realize that for years when this seal was first being created, Benjamin Franklin, who was both an Illuminist and a Satan worshiper, sorry to tell you, and a Freemason, he lobbied for it being a phoenix instead of an eagle. He wanted this bird to be a phoenix. Now, what the heck is a phoenix? Well, the phoenix is an occult mythological bird that goes back to ancient Egypt, and it was called the Bennu bird. And what was distinctive about this bird is that every so often it would immolate itself. It would set itself on fire and be reduced to ashes. And then from the ashes it would spring, reborn, as a new, entirely new bird. And of course this was a symbol of death and resurrection, which is the core of the mysteries of Masonry. Now I want to show you something. Remember I told you to pay attention to that top knot on the top of the eagles on the Scottish Rite symbol? Well, if you look at this very carefully on let me see, it would be this bird here. This is the way Franklin wanted the eagle to look. Now this is the way the eagle actually looks. You'll notice that this eagle has a little top knot that is not really characteristic of the normal bird. Now what I'm going to show you next is an Egyptian hieroglyph of the phoenix in human form. Notice what he's got on his head, a little top knot. This is again another indication of the occult level to which the seal sinks in terms of its symbolism. Now let's talk about the reverse of the seal. First of all, if you look at the ranks of the pyramid on the seal, they relate to the satanic hierarchy. The unfinished pyramid in both architecture and in geometry is called a frustrum. And one side of that pyramid would be called a trapezoid. You'll notice there that this is a trapezoid, this shape, and it's unfinished. You'll notice also that there are 13 ranks here. And then look at the all-seeing eye up there at the top. That all-seeing eye is not God, brothers and sisters. Masons would like you to believe that it is. This is their God, but it ain't my God. I'm sorry. If you study that symbol, that eye is actually called an Utchut eye or a widget eye, and it's a symbol of the all-seeing eye of Osiris or Horus. See, my God is not a cyclops. He has 2 eyes, not just 1 eye. And now down at the bottom here, you'll notice this interesting Roman numeral. If you add that up in the Roman numeral system, it comes up to 1776, which seems appropriate. You'll notice that above it says Annuit Chaptus, and then down below it says Novus Ordo Seclorum. That means this year begins the New World Order. Now, you might think, oh, that's okay, you know, that's America, right? We're the New World Order. No, America did not begin in 1776. Think about it. We hadn't even won the war yet. There were no Articles of Confederation. There was no Constitution. There were no states. This does not refer to America, my friends. On May 1st, 1776, the Illuminati was formed. That is the New World Order. Not America, I'm afraid. They just want to plant the New World Order here. But that is not the New World Order. Now I'm going to put up briefly, this is how that pyramid can be decoded in terms of the satanic hierarchy. And you'll notice down here at the bottom are the conventional degrees of the York and Scottish Rite, all the way up to the Supreme Council of Grand Sovereign Inspectors General.